Welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. In case any of you missed our earlier session today, the extraordinary epoch of Nana Sahib Peshwa, Uday Kulkarni in conversation with William Dalrymple, you can catch this on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook platforms. And you can also view all of the earlier sessions of this series, as well as that from JLF North America. Our second session of the day is the Deoliwallahs, Ma and Dilip D'Souza, in conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. The internment of 3,000 Chinese Indians following the Sino-India War of 1962 is a story not known to many. In a disused World War II prisoner of war camp in Deoli, Rajasthan, Indian citizens of Chinese descent were locked away for 5 years. 7 survivors of this camp have spoken to the author Ma, who has also documented the history of the Chinese community in India and of how they came to be a significant section of the country of their adoption. Ma is aptly placed to release this section of unhappy history, as she was one of a handful of children born at the Deoli internment camp in Rajasthan. She lived in Kolkata and New Delhi while growing up in India. She also attended the Lady Shri Ram College until she left for New School for Social Research in the United States and is now settled in the San Francisco Bay Area. He recently published the book, The Deoliwallahs, The True Story of the 1962 Chinese-Indian Incarceration. Dilip D'Souza has had a global education in India, the UK, and the US. He used to be a computer scientist. Today he writes on politics, society, travel, and mathematics. He's won several awards for his writing, including the Statesman Rural Reporting Award, the Outlook Picador Indian Nonfiction Prize, and the Newsweek South Asia Commentary Prize. He's the author of 8 books, most recently with Ma, The Deoliwallahs, The True Story of the 1962 Chinese-Indian Internment. In conversation with celebrated author and Member of Parliament, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor is an author, politician, and former international civil servant. Currently a third-term Lok Sabha Member of Parliament representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency. He's previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and the Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. He currently chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, and should there be a bandwidth issue today, you know exactly where to point the finger. He's also an award-winning author of both fiction as well as non-fiction, including the great Indian novel, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, The Hindu Way, and The New World Disorder. Dr. Tharoor's 22nd book, which has recently been released, is titled The Battle of Belonging. All our sessions that have been broadcast till now are available on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, the Deoliwallahs, Ma and Dilip D'Souza in conversation with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor, over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you for that delightful introduction to the book, to the people on the panel today. And I must say that I'm very pleased you mentioned the Battle of Belonging, because it actually contains a paragraph about the Deoliwallahs, the true story of the 1962 Chinese-Indian internment by Ma and Dilip D'Souza, our 2 guests today. That's largely because my book is concerned with issues of citizenship, patriotism, nationalism, which essentially, to my mind, could not have been more painfully and meaningfully refracted through another example than the example of the 3,000 Chinese Indians who were sent to languish, as you reminded us all, in a disused World War II POW camp in Deoli, Rajasthan, after the war with China in 1962. That was the beginning of a painful 5-year-long internment without resolution, during which Ma was born. And I must say that we have 2 delightful people to discuss the book with. Dilip D'Souza remains amongst my favorite columnists and writers, a man of tremendous intellectual range. As you said, he used to be a computer geek. He's become a mathematics geek as a columnist, and he's written one of the most delightful books about cricket, a book about Sachin Tendulkar's last test, which I devoured as soon as it came out. And now with the Deoliwallahs, he has ventured into history, politics, ethnography, sociology, and arguably the meaning of citizenship. Joy Ma, as far as I know, hasn't written another book before this, but she is somebody with whom I have a personal connection because her brother, who lived with her in Deoli and who sadly is no longer with us, was a contemporary of mine at St. Xavier's Collegiate High School, Calcutta, Linden Mall. And so I reach out to Joy as somebody through whom, if you like, I feel a certain affinity because her family essentially encapsulates many of the issues and themes that I'd like to raise with the two of them today. As you said, Sanjoy, this is a very painful story when Indians, Chinese names, Chinese features, Chinese family ties were taken from their homes, wrenched out of their lives, transported by train to a place called Deoli they'd never heard of before. In fact, very few Indians have heard of it before. Deoli, Devli, I'm sure I'll get the right pronunciation out of Joy. The war itself with China just lasted a month. People forget that. Whereas the victims in Deoli actually spent over 4 years, almost 5, in this terrible camp, unsanitary conditions, great cold, meager rations. Their lives were completely turned upside down, their dreams, their careers, their businesses crushed, destroyed. And all of this tells us so much about ourselves as a country and as a society. That's why I believe people tuning into today's talk should listen to Dilip and Joy. So let me start with both these authors in sequence. In the book, Dilip is sort of the narrative historian, taking us through the background of the events and the historical dramas that unfolded. Joy is the narrator of the human side of the story. There are interviews with 7 of the survivors. She talks with intimate feeling and knowledge of what went on in Delhi. So we'll try and ask each of them to tell us the story of the book and of their experience writing the book. I'll go with Dilip first because he'll give the background and the history, and then turn to Joy to give us a sense of the stories, not all 7 of them separately, but put together. Dilip, let's start. We know that the war was a calamity for India at every level, lost large chunks of the border, lost Aksai Chin. They marched into what is today Arunachal Pradesh, but fortunately they marched out again. What was the political background of this, and how did it end up that the war resulted in all these people being rounded up?
Well, Shashi, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. You don't know how pleased Joy and I are that you agreed to do this. And thank you to JLF also for organizing this. The story of this war has always intrigued me because for one reason, why did the Chinese come in, fight us for that month or so, and then withdraw to the line they started out from? And the little bit I knew about the war growing up, this one aspect of it always intrigued me. So that's probably where I started from in trying to understand the background of the story. When you go back, you find, and you do some reading, you find that this, as we know today, the border issue between the two countries has never actually been resolved. There's this notion of the line of actual control, but it's in a sense, it's a mythical line in a sense. It's never been actually delineated or delimited. I mean, there are some words that apply, but I'm not fully sure. But and this goes back to treaties that we signed in 1919 in Simla and on, and but the trouble is that it was never actually laid out on the ground. And for that reason, Chinese have one perception, put it very briefly, the Chinese have one perception of where this border or the line of actual control is, and India has another perception. So when you have 2 different perceptions, you're going to have constant feeling on both sides that the other side is infringing on your territory. And so to my mind, this is the history. Through the years, through most of the century leading up to the early 1960s, this was what was going on. We had what Nehru called a forward policy, which was trying to push our notion of the line of actual control. but China saw that as infringing on their territory, so they were pushing back. So this was a constant thing. All through the 1950s, there were little conflicts, bigger conflicts. There were meetings between the leaders, but this was never actually resolved. And in the end, in 1962, after various provocations, I think my feeling is China just decided, Mao just decided, we've got to teach these guys a lesson, whatever that means. And so they just, as India thinks of it as a great betrayal, and that's what happened. They marched in, as you said, into Arunachal, into all along this the border that we have, and Indian forces were not ready for this at all in every respect, whether material or weapons or even just psychologically. And they overran our positions. A month later, they decided, okay, we've done enough, and they went back to their position, and the war was over. The fallout was, of course, that after that, after that war was over, we put 3,000 Chinese Indians into this camp in Deoli, as you know. And so that's in a nutshell, really, the background that I understand for this war.
Quite right. Joy, you were born in Delhi, of course, but you already had siblings who had been born earlier. Tell us a little bit about your parents' lives before this tragic arrest on Chinese New Year's Day, as I recall, when you were dragged off, or your parents were dragged off. Tell us the background of your family. I know the Chinese Indian community goes back as far as 1778. And there were some 26,000 Chinese Indians in our country at the end of World War II. So it wasn't exactly a minuscule community. When did your folks trace their background in India too? And what was your own, what was their recollection when they talked to you about it, of what happened to them?
Thank you, Shashi. So my great grand uncle had come to India from Canton, Guangdong province in China in the late 1880s, and he was the one who was the first one who came, and he built over years. He worked in Assam, and then he went on and was hired by this tea estate in this area called Alipurduars, and this particular area was Hasimara. And so he built a company, and he brought his brothers to work with him because he was the oldest, and he had many siblings and many brothers to work with. And so my father, Jack, was born in Hachimara, and he grew up learning how to speak Oral, maybe a little bit Hindi, and of course Cantonese. And when he was 6, he went back to China because there were no schools there. He went to China to study. And eventually, I guess my grandfather's belief was he would join the civil service in China because that's like a lifelong employment opportunity. But of course, there was the war with Japan and China, and he left China and came back to work in India. And so when he came back, World War II was raging, and there was actually a project in that area that was to build an airstrip, and that airstrip would fuel the planes to fly over the hump and perhaps go all the way to Japan. But then soon after that, the war ended, and I think that airstrip was barely built, but it was hiding under the canopy of the rainforest. So it's a fascinating story. My mom grew up in Kalimpong, and Kalimpong has a fascinating history. Kalimpong, to me, is the area where India and China connect from a trade route. Like many lives were built. You had at one time you had Tibetan traders, you had traders from China, you had people from Afghanistan. It became a huge area for exiled royalty. And so mom grew up with all these folks, she would talk about the princess and so on. And so eventually they both met, and they settled in dad's home. And things were fine until the war. But, as my mom narrates it to me, you could see how the political situation was changing. So that's a brief history our family. And
I understand that you were actually born in that camp, but that your parents had a reasonably comfortable life beyond that. Did your parents must have talked to you, I'm assuming, with time, about what it felt like to be picked up? I mean, the Chinese Indians were picked up in places like Shillong, Darjeeling, Tinsukia, Kalimpong, all sorts of places which they thought of as home, forced to carry just the bare minimum with them. There was this horrible week-long rail journey in which I gather many of the trains had enemy train written outside the compartment. And in one station, people were throwing stones at them and waving chappals at them. And so it must have been an awful feeling. And as you point out in the book, most of them have been in India for generations. Most felt more Indian than Chinese. How did it feel suddenly that their homeland was rejecting them? I mean, did they talk to you a little bit about the emotions they went through?
So being a child, they didn't tell me as much. They would just tell me the situation, and it was only later on when I was writing the book that my mother talked about how the army came and just sort of occupied the whole area outside of their compound, and there were sentry posts put up. The entire seemed like a whole unit was billeted there. But when I spoke to the other people, the people who were teenagers and tweens who had gone to and locked up in Deoli, it was the most horrifying, devastating, emotional experience for them. You have to think of it as you're asking a teenager, you're locking a teenager up, you're treating them like a criminal. And for years and decades, the question that resonated with them is, what have I done to deserve that? What has my family done? What has my father done to be treated like a criminal? So those emotions stayed with them for a very long time. I think it triggered a lot of the other feelings that they had of, really being treated unequally. You're not treated as a citizen, you're just treated as a foreigner. And just to illustrate how deep this feeling was when they landed in Deoli, a place where you mentioned nobody'd heard of. So clearly Deoli had never heard that there were Chinese in India. So when they were registering them, they were shocked to hear that they could speak Hindi, and they were like looking at them like they were baffled. And then of course there was like some education going on at the desk. It was just to me, I mean, to hear that was really heartbreaking. You have like these kids.
Exactly. I remember Rafiq Elias's documentary about this group in 2015, I think it was, or thereabouts, in which he actually has some of these Chinese Indian characters speaking in Hindi. And and this is years, decades after they've left India. Their Hindi is so fluent. And I wonder what these cops or the detention camp people in Rajasthan must have thought. They thought they were detaining a bunch of foreigners and enemies, and these were Indians who just happened to be ethnically different. I'll come back to you because there is another aspect I want to probe with you, Joy, but let me turn back to Dilip. Dilip, one of the things, I mean, obviously there's a lot I want to discuss with both of you about the implications of all this, but before we get to that, one of the things is, of course, that the war was over when this started. I mean, something that people forget, it's not that during the war there was this heightened paranoia and therefore people were being rounded up. The war was actually over. And what's interesting is that the Defense of India Act was passed in 1962, defining the enemy as any person committing external aggression against India and any person belonging to a country committing such aggression. Now that's, my book is called The Battle of Belonging. For me, what is the country you belong to? To my mind, it seems to me the country you belong to is the country you live in, whose citizenship you seek or bear, whose nationality you profess. But clearly, in 1962, with the background of the war, what many people in the Indian government felt was that if you looked Chinese, if you were ethnically Chinese, then you belonged to China, even if you'd never ever seen that country, Unlike Joy's dad, who had been there as a student, many of the Chinese Indians had never even been to China. They were deemed to be, quote, any person belonging to a country committing aggression against India. And then, of course, the Indian government amended the Foreigners Act to say that any person whose parents or grandparents were subjects or citizens of any country that India was at war with could be interned. Now, to my mind, these are very troubling questions for Indians, for Indian citizens, and for people concerned with an implicit definition of Indians. What do you make of these executive and parliamentary actions, legislative actions, that essentially laid the groundwork, the foundations for the imprisonment of the Chinese Indians in Deoli?
What I make of it above all, Shashi, is that it seems to me that this is resonating even today. You know, what we see with the Citizenship Amendment Act and this National Register of Citizens has roots going back to what happened in 1962. I mean, it's clear as daylight to me. When you start to define citizenship or define non-citizenship, whatever it is, as based on somebody's looks or I mean, essentially that's what it was. This was a small community that was easily identifiable. Therefore, it was easy to lock them up. And when you define citizenship like that, when you start to say that these people can be treated this way because they're not really Indian, then it becomes easy to do it to other communities too. And that's my worry. That's the legacy of Deoli to me. It's a constant worry to me that this is going to be applied at some point to communities that are deemed inconvenient now, and tomorrow it will be some other community that is deemed inconvenient, and it will just keep on happening because it happened, it really happened, and it was a successful endeavor back in 1962. You know, these laws, these Defense of India Ordinance and the Foreigners Registration Act, whatever they are called, they actually make no sense to me. As a citizen, it seems like these have got to be violations of the wonderful constitution that we gave ourselves in 1950. And yet, so I wish somebody would examine it in that context and see where we are today.
Well, you mentioned the Citizenship Amendment Act. One of the amusing, perhaps not so amusing because it's a painful thing in many ways, and many of us have protested it from start to finish, but it's ironic, let's put it that way, not amusing, that it's in direct contradiction with the Defense of India Act. Yes. Because the Defense of India Act says that if you have a country that commits external aggression against India, then any person belonging to that country is an enemy. That means anyone who belongs to Pakistan, irrespective of their religion, should technically be an enemy under the Defense of India Act. But in practice, you're extending fast-track citizenship to them as long as they're not Muslim. It is a very, very peculiar idea. Go on, Dilip, you're going to react to that.
No, I was just saying that this act, the CAA, is a travesty. I will say it again and again. It's a violation of everything that I've held dear as being Indian all my life, and I think millions of people like me have held dear. And it was a shock to me that it had its roots back in 1962 when I started writing this book.
Well, your book, both of you, Dilip and Joy, should really be proud of the fact that your book has made many Indian readers confront the meaning of citizenship. What makes you a citizen? What are the criteria? And what excludes you from that perception? But I want to come back to Joy for a minute, Dilip, if I may. Yeah. You know, it's interesting, Joy, that at some point, you must have been a toddler, the government offered some of the internees a choice to go back, quote unquote, to China. And the Chinese government sent 3 ships. And as Dilip writes, in 1963, 1,000 people, over 1,000 people, did sail back to China. Some, like your family, chose to stay in India. That's the country that you saw as home, and you saw yourself as Indians. Couldn't have been an easy decision. Can you tell me a little bit, did you talk to your parents about how they made that choice? Did you talk to anybody who made the opposite choice and went to China? Is there any sense you can share with the listeners about these the division of opinion in these two directions?
Yes, sure. So for my parents, for my dad, his work and his employment and his business was in India. There was absolutely no question for him to leave because if he was able to go back to work and be there and claim, because they did, we had to destroy everything when like parts of the family moved away, and then we went to Deoli. So for him, the choice was pretty clear, especially when Lal Bahadur Shastri went to the camp and said, who among you would like to stay in India and who would you want to go to China? Here's the line. You stand here, you stand this side. And for those who choose to stay in India, you will be able to go home and work. And what better option would that be, especially for dad and my mom? But it turned out that that promise, that option was never allowed. And in fact, all the people who left India, who left the camp, were not allowed to go back to sensitive areas like, Kalimpong and wherever my dad came from. For the other families, it was particularly one family friend. They had a lot of, they had no work to go back to because the trade in Kalimpong was destroyed, right? There was no, once the border was shut, there was no business for them. And so for them, the only option was to go to China. And so they, all of them went. None of the kids had gone to China. The mom was a local lady. She had never gone to China. And the only person who had been to China was the husband who came from China to India to work. So for those families who had no business to go back to, especially in Kalimpong, they made the option to leave. And it was a tough decision, but there was no option. Right? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you mentioned businesses. I mean, many of them were in all sorts of very interesting and viable businesses, right? They were leather trading, running restaurants. Um, they were entrepreneurs. I mean, Tangra in Calcutta was Chinatown, right? It was full of Chinese entrepreneurs who had made a viable life for themselves. Um, I I do find that what you've written about, and you've narrated some painful human stories of the people there. Um, that is a tale of what happens in many ways to people who are trapped by ignorance, by suspicion, by hatred, for things, when you haven't committed a crime, but merely the way you look or the ethnicity you belong to, or today, as Dilip reminds us, the religion you belong to, is enough to immediately cast a web of other people's paranoia and suspicion around you, and prejudice and fear around you. That becomes a very, very painful story. And I think it's wonderful, Joy, that even 5 decades after this tragedy, you were able to get people to tell their stories and to share them meaningfully with the readers of your book. Um, Let me turn again to Dilip. Dilip, I mean, I have this sense that when we look at what the Indian Constitution talks about, this whole issue of belonging, to use the word that I've used in the title of my book, um, ultimately, the Indian Constitution actually makes no reference to ethnicity. The entire logic of Indian nationhood in the Constitution is that it doesn't matter what your religion is, your region is, your language is, your caste is, your ethnicity is. If you live in India, you're a citizen of India, you seek to be a citizen of India, you are Indian. And the Constitution grants you all the same equal rights as everybody else. But today, we are seeing a version of nationalism being broadcast by those in power who argue that actually there is one particular religion and one ethnicity that is favored in this country, and even one language. It's Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan. That is their favorite slogan. And for them, therefore, other religions, other ethnicities, other languages make people suspect give them a lesser entitlement to be regarded as citizens of India in the same way as others. In your last chapter, Dilip, you get into this issue a bit. Would you like to share your thoughts on this with the listeners?
You know, Shashi, just like you, I've been obsessed with this idea of citizenship and patriotism and national. What do these things mean? I had a choice at one point, just speaking personally, I had a choice. I lived in the States for 10 years in the United States. I could have stayed on there, become a citizen like plenty of my contemporaries. I chose to come back here to India. I made that choice. The Muslims in 1947 who stayed in India made that choice. This country, the great thing, I mean, I'm not one for saying that I love my country and so on, but the great thing about this country is that it is what you said. It made Constitution makes no demands on us. You live in India, you pay your taxes, you live by the laws, you are an Indian. That's enough for me, and it should be enough for everybody. I mean, that's what made us a model for the world in our first many decades of independence. The tragedy is that the way we're hacking at that today, with narrowing down our definition of Indianness every single day. You know, when I look at this crazy love jihad law in UP, to me that's one more slicing away at this India that I knew, that I grew up with, that I came to live in back in 30 years ago. So on, and now the Citizenship Amendment Act is like that. There is no end, I feel, to the way that this notion, this one great idea of India is being destroyed, and that's in a great sense. I mean, in a real sense, that is why I wanted to write this book, because I felt like what happened to people like Joy encapsulates exactly this idea of what we're doing to our country today.
So what lessons can we draw from your book and from the past it describes? How do we ensure that history doesn't repeat itself?
I'm at a loss, Shashi. You know, honestly, I think history is going to repeat itself. We are building those damn detention camps as we speak. You know, in what sense can I say with any sincerity that history is not going to repeat itself? I'm sorry, I'm just pessimistic about this. I think we are going down this path of destruction and tragedy, and at some point it's going to explode in our faces. And I honestly believe that. I cannot bring myself to be more optimistic than that about it.
Joy, am I right in saying that though you talked to a number of the internees, you didn't actually have a chance to contact anybody who had exercised the option of going back to China or their descendants? Is that right?
A lot of those people didn't want to, I could only speak to people who wanted to talk, right? Who were willing to. But we are in touch with those people, but they didn't want to be a part of the book. In fact, it was kind of hard to find people in India who wanted to speak about it. So we have someone who is sort of anonymized. But yeah, I was only able to talk to people who wanted to speak about it.
In fact, Shashi, that's one of the tragedies that people in India, Chinese and Indians in India don't want to. They're so fearful now. 6 decades later, they're fearful that this is going to happen again. They don't want to talk about it.
Sure, no, I can understand. Sorry, Joy, go ahead.
Sorry, just to go back. So we know a lot of people who went to China and who came out. So they immigrated to Hong Kong, Canada, or the United States, and they've made new lives here. So there has been, and there are people who did stay back in China. They have alumni group meetings, and they have people who also settled in Hong Kong. Likewise, they do meet annually.
You now live in California, right? I'm sure you've come across Professor Anand Yang.
Not yet.
No, he's done some extraordinarily interesting scholarship and writing about all of that. But let me come to you with another question, which is perhaps an embarrassing one to ask you bluntly, given that you're not just a victim of Delhi, somebody who was born there. We all know that in 1988, the US government delivered a formal apology to the Japanese Americans whom they had interned in World War II. At least they had the excuse there actually was a war raging, but they didn't intern or lock up the German Americans and the Italian Americans. It was only the Japanese Americans. So there was some racism there as well. And they did apologize very formally. Should India, the government of India, formally acknowledge that it did wrong in locking up the Chinese Indians of Deoli and apologize to them collectively and individually, in your view?
Yes, I believe they should. But I think there's a step before that to actually acknowledge that such an event happened. So I think there's a lot of lack of awareness among just the, whoever, the people in government, or and even lack of awareness from the public. And so once we don't get, to have people understand the situation, it's kind of going to be difficult to get that apology. So I believe there should be an acknowledgement and there should be an apology.
Well, I think you're right that it's worth trying. And we have, in the non-corona days, when we had a normally functioning parliament, there is the device of a parliamentary resolution that one could have pushed. Very little chance of doing that these days. But I will see what I can do as an MP. I do think that we honor ourselves when we admit our own wrongs and our own mistakes.
Think of what an apology like that will do to us as a country. What will it do for us?
Yeah, I really think that India is a marvelous country. I mean, I have, I am. When I talk about myself, I'm part Chinese, I'm part Indian, I'm part whatever sort of Western U.S. Kind of identity I have. And it's just, if the Constitution were totally upheld the way it was imagined, it is a beautiful thing.
I've been given a 5-minute warning by the organizers. Let me recall, if I may, it's an unfair thing to do to two authors, a paragraph from a book by another writer, a little before you. And this is Yin Marsh's Doing Time with Nehru in 2012, which covered some of the same ground. And she wrote, let me quote, "As I wrote this book, I felt it was important that I not emphasize those events in negative terms. Rather, I wanted to shed light on the unfortunate and sad consequences of government policies, which were more viscerally motivated than reasonably thought out. When actions are hastily taken based on ethnic, racial, and religious divisions, they inevitably have adverse impacts on families and communities, and indeed on the national psyche." Very wise, very moving. But did you, first of all, were you aware of this book when you wrote your own? And did you feel joy, a similar desire not to emphasize the negative? I can say that Dilip certainly does feel a certain level of concern and anger as an Indian, of Indian ethnicity, one might say that, though I believe that every ethnicity is qualified to be Indian, so it's not an easy thing to express. Do you, Joy, feel that somehow you felt any pressure not to be negative or to look at this, or were you just telling the story that you felt needed to be told?
I did feel some pressure not to be negative, to be able to communicate the story in a way that would touch people's hearts, because I think that was the most important thing. And to be honest, a lot of people have moved on. But what I did realize in writing the book is when we don't acknowledge errors like this and gross mistakes, they're bound to happen again. And so that was the driving force in writing this book, to make sure that it was a part of history. It was a part of history that was indelible, not just in our minds, but also in the hearts of people. So yes, it's a very polarizing topic, unfortunately, but what you really need to look at is it's a humanitarian tragedy, and it's touched so many people's lives, and that's where we want to focus on.
Well, that leads perfectly into the final question, which has been addressed to both of you by a listener, Jaya Padmanabhan. Dilip and Joy, have you received any pushback to the book and the discussion of India's failure in acknowledging the grievous harm done? Any negative feedback? Indeed, share with us if the feedback's all been positive. Dilip?
None at all. I mean, let's take, we've had a number of very good reviews. We've had, sessions like this one where we think people have listened with interest. I don't recall anyone actually, there's an occasional Twitter troll who'll say something nasty, but you can discount that. But but apart from that, I don't think there's been uh, any real serious pushback in any sense. That may be a sign that nobody important has read the book, but that, you know, I don't know about that. Now you have read it, so maybe you can tell us if you come across any negative.
No, in fact, I think that frankly the trolls don't read by and large, neither your books nor mine. But Joy, living where you are, I imagine you've not had any pushback, but have you had any feedback?
Had a lot of feedback from like obviously my friends who I actually didn't tell till the beginning of this year. Was it 2020? Yes, and and so it's been all positive. People are outraged by it, and that's a wonderful thing, you know, to have people evoke an emotional response. And you know, I think to put yourself in the shoes of people who were interned for no reason but the way they looked is a really is a powerful thing, and you know, gives you pause. And so we want that to happen. We want them to share, and yeah, no negative responses.
Great. Well, that I think we have been told we're running out of time. In fact, I've got a big bold message from the organizer saying time out. Let me thank you both, Dilip and Joy. History is a peculiar thing. It reveals such astonishing facets of our own humanity and sometimes our lack thereof. It has, of course, bizarre and unpredictable consequences. The migration of Chinese Indians after this Deoli experience to places like Canada and the United States have given birth, amongst other things, to that extraordinary phenomenon, the Chinese Indian restaurant, or when I call it the Chinese Indian Chinese restaurant in some places, where they have dishes like gobi Manchurian that never existed in China or before the Chinese came there. And so, in a curious way, there's always some happy or non-negative consequences, historical aberrations. Nonetheless, the Deoliwallahs tells a story that remains a blight on the consciences of any thinking Indian. I look forward to the day when we will actually stand up and have the courage and the moral honesty to apologize to the Chinese Indians for the way we treated them. And let us celebrate the handful who have remained and made successful lives in India, including a cricket correspondent and television journalist you've seen on television, I'm sure, Dilip D'Souza. We've had a few Chinese Indians in positions of visibility and prominence. But to those who have left these shores, like Joy, let me thank you, Joy, for staying engaged, staying evolved, and helping us evoke this extraordinary tale that really will be an education to all Indians. Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you,
Dilip,
Shashi.
Thank you, Shashi.
reading you on all subjects.
Thank you so much.
Our sense of nationhood and citizenship stripped of these biases and prejudices, whether ethnic or religious. Thank you very much, and I hand you back to Sanjoy Roy.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Joy Ma. And of course, there's also the Calcutta Chinese, the Bengali Chinese, and the Punjabi Chinese food that we must absolutely acknowledge. But you're absolutely right, Shashi. And here's a question for you. We know that history repeats itself primarily because people, as you said, don't read. And that's one of the reasons it goes round and round. But when it comes to internment, whether it was in Canada during World War II or whether it's in India during 1962, is this one for the United Nations to sort of write in to its charter during wars that you don't inter necessarily people? Is that a possibility?
No, there is one. There is the Geneva Convention, but it applies only to wartime. And this particular internment took place after the war was over, bizarrely enough. So no, it's more a question of human rights and basic treatment, decent treatment. I'm sorry that India took 5 years to realize that what it did was wrong and equally unnecessary, and that finally people were released. In fact, one of the ironies is when Chinese Indians were released, China itself was going through terrible convulsions, and many of those Chinese who sailed back on those 3 ships were reaching the China of the Cultural Revolution with the Red Guards, probably anxious to re-educate them. I'm not sure they could have been terribly happy. All I can say is that an apology. Same thing I've been demanding from the British for 200 years of oppression of this country is what I believe we should do to the Chinese Indians who suffered for 5 years in Deoli.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you, Joy Ma, and thank you, Dilip D'Souza. That was an absolutely fascinating conversation. We're sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that we weren't able to take the many questions that you sent in because we didn't want to disrupt this particular conversation that we were having. We do look forward to having you back on our next show next Wednesday. We've got two fabulous sessions lined up for you, so please do check our website and our handles. We've got the Rebellious Lord, which will be on Friday the 11th. Lord Meghnad Desai in conversation with John Eliot. Lord Meghnad Desai's latest offering, Rebellious Lord, is an autobiography that is a personal account of a distinguished public man. His unorthodox approach to world economics led to his forming centers of study at the London School of Economics. He discusses his long-awaited autobiography, and this will be at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 1:30 p.m. GMT, and at 8:30 a.m. EST. This is followed by What We Carry, Maya Shanbag Lang, in conversation with Supriya Dravid on the mother-daughter relationship. This is at 8:30 p.m. IST, 3 p.m. GMT, and 10 a.m. EST. Till then, stay masked, stay safe.